Welcome. So I'm Bradley Thomas and recently re-elected as the FinPro President for 2021, which I'm very excited about. So, and it's great to have so many people along today at this next webinar. Can I firstly pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the custodians of the land of which we're meeting on today. And we continue to meet virtually, so on many lands. I'm on the Judge Ararung lands today. As I said, today we've got another one in our series of webinars, and they've been extremely well received by our members. And this one really comes out of actually feedback directly from members. A number of people were providing questions to Gab around fraud awareness, policy development and training. And so what we've been able to do is get a panel from Crowe together to provide a series of information for us today. So once again, I'd say to you, if you've got a topic or something that you're really looking to get some information on, feed it through to Gab and we can often turn that into a bit of a webinar. We've got the poll in front of us and the number of you are filling out. That'll just give the guys from Crowe a bit of context of where we're starting today's process. The slides will be shared afterwards today, and we will probably have some time for questions at the end. So if you do have questions, pop them in the chat, or I'll open up at the end of today's session and we'll go into there. Today from Crowe, we've got Andrew, Gabrielle and Linda, who are all partners or senior managers at Crowe, and it's great to have them along. Crowe's been a really important partner with FinPro over the years, particularly in the model budget and model accounts scene, but great to have these guys along. And I know a number of councils have a direct relationship with them through their internal audit or use them to do some training. So we're hoping it'll be a fantastic session for today. I've just ended that poll and we can start to see those results coming through. So thanks to the 50 odd people that jumped in and answered those questions. I'll just share those results with you so that you can see them, but that's enough from me, and I'm going to hand over to Andrew from Crowe, partner of their risk consulting business, and he'll take us through our presentation today. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Bradley. Thanks for the opportunity and welcome everyone. Some familiar names in the sheet, so looking forward to spending a little bit of time with you today. Thanks for participating in the poll results. Look, we do a number of fraud audits across the sector, and we ask some of these questions. And the results I'm seeing are not overly surprising. But they're really pleasing as well. It's good to see that we conduct regular fraud risk assessments, which is pleasing. Good to see that we've got a comprehensive fraud control awareness program within our organisations. The protected disclosures is always an interesting one, or public interest disclosures, how they're not surprising. There's quite still a number of percentage of people that have completed the survey that aren't quite aware of what rights are protected, are afforded to them in relation to that. It's good to see that we understand how to report a suspicion of fraud in our organisation, and that it's actually made relatively easy, although there still is some improvement opportunities to try and make that process even easier. So thank you all for participating. Bradley, I'll get you to stop sharing the results. Now, can you guys see my screen?
Perfect,
you guys see the Fraudster screens? Right, yep. Thank you for that. Look, thanks everyone. Welcome again today. My name is Andrew, as Bradley said, and we're going to talk a little bit about fraud awareness. Just to make it clear, this presentation is not going to be a masterclass on how to commit fraud and how to cover it up and get away with it. So apologies to those that are hoping for a different type of presentation. We've conducted, as I said, quite a number of fraud reviews, internal audits across the sector. So some of the things you're going to see today are going to be fairly common sense. Some of the things you would have heard before, and hopefully there's a few little bits of nuggets that you might find as well. In terms of what we're going to be looking at today, we're going to cover off a little bit about policy, not specific to what your organisation has. but really around what your organisation fraud policy should look like. We'll look at some definitions and the concept of a fraud triangle. Linda will take us through some case studies around procurement, contract management fraud, and also grants. We'll also have a look at what fraud is, how it can manifest itself. Gabrielle will take us through some red flags and how fraud is detected. We'll look at the concept of a typical fraudster, some internal controls. The impact of fraud is really interesting. I want to cover off a little bit about the culture piece, and we'll also have a look at some mechanics and dynamics of fraud prevention within your organisation. Firstly, just to cover off on the fraud policy, each and every one of your organisations will have something different in terms of a fraud awareness policy. It should clearly articulate the purpose. So what's the intent? What's the intent of the policy? There'll be some definitions in there, and we'll cover those in a moment. It'll have a significant statement around what the organisation's tolerance is for fraud. It'll talk about the concept of prevention and detection, and also the possibility of investigations going forward. What it'll also do is it'll also link to a series of other policies that your organisation will have, and those policies will cover off on conflict of interest, gifts, benefits and hospitalities, obviously your staff and your counsellor code of conduct, and also public disclosures and your risk management process. So everyone should have a policy that they can refer back to. Next, we'll cover off some definitions, and we've highlighted a couple of words in red there, really to try and bring to the fore some of the common themes in terms of the definitions of fraud and corruption. It really, if we focus on fraud, really it is a dishonest activity that involves deception, and there's going to be a loss. So there'll be a potential gain to someone and a loss to the typically to the organisation. Unfortunately, fraud and corruption work hand in hand. In terms of corruption, it really is the dishonest activity, but more so it's about the ability for someone to impose undue influence on someone else. So their ability to abuse their position for personal gain or advantage, and that'll really come to the fore when we have a look at one of the case studies later on. When we're talking about definitions, we're not talking about mistakes or unintentional acts. It really is around the deliberate concept of conducting something and trying to impose our will. Feel free to, if you have any questions, feel free to include those in the chat boxes, and we'll work towards getting to those at the end of the session. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the fraud triangle. Now, some of you may be familiar with the concept of the fraud triangle, and what it's really designed to do is trying to give us a bit of an understanding in terms of the psyche of what goes through the mind of a typical fraudster, not only when they're committing the fraud, but also leading up to committing the fraud as well. And of those concepts, there are really some things that the organisation can control. However, there's also a couple of things that the organisation is actually unable to control. In terms of the first point of the triangle, it's really the incentive. So what's the motivation? So why is someone looking to commit fraud or committing fraud in the first place? Now, sometimes there might be some noble intentions. You might want to help out a friend who might have either a financial difficulty or a health crisis, etc. But the motivation may also be that you want to hurt, or you might have a desire to hurt your organisation. So there's got to be a reason why. And sometimes it could also be greed. Second part of that is the opportunity. So how are you going to do it? What sort of access do you have to what system that's going to enable you to not only set up the fraud, but to keep it going, to cover your tracks, and to make sure no one finds out? How are you going to conceal it? And the opportunity particularly might lend itself to those that are of senior positions, because they have the ability to override particular controls. It might be those that have access, so there might be a lack of segregation of duties across your organisation, which gives you absolute control of the end-to-end functions. Or your internal controls might just be that poorly designed that they're not really effective. So the opportunity is really something that the organisation can control by way of its internal control framework. the last part of the triangle is really just around rationalising it. So the fraudster typically, and these concepts have come through years of study by psychologists and the like. The third concept, as I said, is really around the attitude and the rationalisation. So just really justifying it to yourself or to the fraudster that it's okay to commit the fraud. It might be because, you know, you've got a sense, as I mentioned earlier, you've got a sense of you've got noble intentions and you want to help someone out. Or it might be because you've got a sense that you're being underpaid or underappreciated and you want to get back to the organisation. You might have a sense of entitlement as well. Your organisation's got heaps of money. If I commit a little fraud and take some, what's the big deal? So there really is a justification, an internal justification for committing the fraud. I also like to think that there's probably one other component to the fraud triangle in relation to that, is that really is around competence. Even if you do have the incentive and the opportunity and you rationalise it with self, you rationalise it to yourself, you also need to be competent. You need to know how to commit the fraud. You need to know how to set up your systems, and you also need to know how to cover off your tracks. Hopefully that's given us a little bit of an insight in terms of what the fraud triangle is, what some of the thoughts that go through the typical fraudster's mind. Next, I'm going to hand over to Linda, who's going to cover off a couple of case studies, in particular around procurement, contract management, and also sports frauds. Linda, over to you.
The two case studies that I'll be presenting today will demonstrate the themes of fraud and corruption that Andrew's really just spoken about. The first one is in relation to what we've termed sports frauds. Earlier last year, an issue came to light around the issue of federal government sporting grant funding. There was a high level of media attention. It was very public, played out in the public space. But the grant program is administered by the Australian Sports Commission or Sports Australia. And funding is there to support sporting clubs around Australia to really allow Australians to have more access to quality sporting facilities. So the sporting clubs are required to submit applications that are assessed against set criteria to determine whether they will be successful in receiving the grant funds. The first round was
Linda, just sorry to jump in, just wondering if you're a little bit further away from your microphone or something than you were before. It's just a bit hard to hear.
Can you hear me now?
That's much better, Linda. Thank you.
Sorry about that. So I'll just keep going then. So sporting clubs were required to submit applications that are assessed against set criteria to determine whether they'll be successful in receiving the grant funds. So the first round was offered in August and September in 2019. 2,056 applications were received that were seeking $397 million. So there's a lot of money involved with this. Sports Australia assessed all the applications and they assessed them against published assessment criteria that was predetermined prior to the assessments being made. In addition to that, the Sports Minister at the time assessed the applications using other considerations. And those considerations were not known prior to the assessments of the grant applications. So the Minister then went ahead and awarded $100 million worth of grant funds, and that represented 684 grant applications. And of those 684, 400 did not meet the cutoff scores that were based on Sports Australia assessment criteria. So they're the facts in very simplistic form. But when we think about what went wrong here, there were 6 grants that were approved that weren't supported with an application form. There were 5 grants were approved despite not meeting the Sports Australia recommended scores. And obviously the 11 changes made to the final list, if you like, were made by the Sports Minister's office. So there was a lot of questions around whether the minister had the question over the minister override, if you like, of the Sports Australia decisions and whether there was a legal authority to do so. The minister's office almost had like a parallel process happening alongside of Sports Australia. They were undertaking their own assessment process. And the recommendations made by the minister were not then approved by the Sports Australia board, and there was no consultation really with the opposition. And I guess specifically to the sports minister herself at the time, there wasn't a conflict of interest declared. There was an existing personal relationship with one of the sporting clubs that were a successful recipient of grant funds. So in a snapshot, can this happen to your organisation, or can it happen in local government? And the answer is yes. There's a direct correlation between what happened here in sports rorts in the federal government can happen to council in their local grants programs. The similar process same or similar process would occur or does occur at councils. Obviously, there's a varying level of funds and different grant types, but they still go through an application and assessment and approval steps, which is similar to at the federal level. And also, considering the role of councillors in this space, could they override a councillor's officer's decision, similar to potentially what the minister was involved in? And that's another thing to consider. So what we only have to think about, how do we prevent this type of fraud or corruption element of override, like overriding decisions for a personal benefit? We have to start thinking about key internal controls that are specific to the grant program, and we need to make sure that they're clear and transparent. The assessment criteria that is preset prior to the applications being awarded, and we wouldn't want to have two alternate systems running here, like the Sports Victoria and the Minister's Office. We want one system. We want it to be applied on a consistent basis. Each grant round should be assessed in the same way as the one prior or the one preceding. The assessment process itself has to be documented clearly, and with how we arrive at scores and rankings, and recording why the applications or some applications were unsuccessful. And we have to really understand who's making the decisions and who's awarding the grant funds. It has to be clear and transparent, so we don't get in a situation where we could potentially have an override or a change to decisions. So the National Audit Office, the Australian National Audit Office, has actually done an audit into this case, or assessing whether the awarding of the grants program was informed and appropriate. There's been 26 recommendations made, and I'll just say that the report makes for good reading and good learnings, and I recommend you guys have a read of that in your spare time. When we think about the next case study I'll just talk to is the cleaning contracts at V-Line. And you may have heard of this one or not, but it's currently a case study. This case study is subject to an IBAC investigation, Operation Esperance. And IBAC are investigating into allegations of serious corrupt conduct during the tendering, procurement and management of major contracts within V-Line and Metro Trains. So in summary, I guess the allegation is that the allegations are that the contract manager of the cleaning contract at Metro Trains accepted significant cash payments to help the cleaning contractor. Now, they helped the cleaning contractor not only to keep the contract that was in place, it was worth $40 million, but also to be the successful tenderer of additional cleaning services at the commencement of COVID, when COVID came in, and the additional services were worth $1.3 million a month. So there was significant money, the tender was worth a significant value. And the contract manager worked to sort of assist the contractor in keeping the contract by covering up some poor performance or overlooking services that weren't delivered. Like the trains were supposed to be cleaned at a higher level due to COVID, with extra spraying and cleaning, and that service wasn't provided. The decisions were made. I mean, the cash payments were received in bundles of but received using envelopes of cash handed over on a monthly basis, and they were said to equate to about 150,000 at that time. Also, during the inquiry at IBAC, the CEO had admitted to accepting bribes as well, to the value of about 320,000, but that was a bit earlier on in 2018 and 2019. But overall, both the CEO and the senior contract manager involved here in this allegation have both been terminated in wake of this investigation. And I think the outcome of this investigation will be very interesting. But again, what went wrong here? We need to understand, well, you know, when we talk about fraud and corruption, what went wrong here? One of the main things that went wrong here was the tender process was improperly influenced by monetary incentives. The contract manager made some decisions because he was given a cash reward. And that's when we talk back to the fraud triangle and those sort of things and the definition of fraud. The monetary incentives were that's the incentive that made the contract manager make the decisions. So the other thing that went wrong was the internal controls into the tender allocation process and the awarding of the additional contract service. That wasn't undertaken with proper evaluation and probably approval levels. The integrity of the procurement process was not evident. There was undeclared relationships, conflict of interests. There was undeclared gifts to public officers. And when we see this happens, that often gives rise or may give rise to actual or a perceived corrupt conduct by any time we receive a gift to a public officer. The other thing that was evident here that is the collusion between the senior officers. Evidence has been provided to IBAC to support this, and the CEO and the contract manager worked together in manipulating the outcomes for the contractor. So again, can this happen in local government? The answer is yes, and it's probably likely to be happening at some extent at the moment. Local government procure a lot of services through tender processes. They manage extensive contracts. There is a lot of contract managers delivering services across the organisation. So yes, it can happen, and it could be happening. So again, how do we prevent this from happening? We need to build strong integrity around our procurement functions, our tendering process, our internal controls around how we assess tenders and how we award the successful tenders has to be clear and transparent. Our assessment criteria needs to be developed well in advance of the tender going out. We need to we need to remove the ability to have improper influence here, and we have to sort of set out very clearly who is the approver, if you like, who's going to make the decision, and who's got the delegated authority to make the decisions. The other area is contract management. We need to have strong contract management controls. We need to understand how contractors are monitored and managed, particularly if there's non-delivery of services. We need to have, again, management of conflict of interest. That's always, that's an element that's common across both of these case studies. And the receipt of gifts, benefits and hospitality. The receipt of gifts and benefits, the management of those is very important to the management of fraud and corruption, or preventing fraud and corruption. So I guess the corruption activity in this case is pretty overt. There's lots of cash, receipt of cash bribes in envelopes is quite overt activity. I think the thing to remember is corruption doesn't have to be as overt as this. It can be the waiving of a parking fine, or accepting a kindergarten enrolment that's late, or is something. It doesn't have to be as overt as the cash in the envelope. So that's going forward. Just have a think about that in your day-to-day operations. Over to you. Back to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Linda. Very, very comprehensive As you can see, particularly the procurement and the tendering one, it really is a checklist of all the things that can go wrong in an instance of fraud and corruption. So why does it occur? I think we've just heard quite a number of reasons why fraud occurs across your businesses, and quite simply, it's due to the fact of a combination of some or all of those matters that you see on the screen. Really poorly designed internal controls, and also the ability to override controls, a lack of accountability across people within your organisation, the ability to collude between not only employees internally but also with contractors, and that was quite evident in the V-Line case study. Could also be a simple case of greed, but I think the more important one of all the ones on there is really around the tone at the top and the organisational culture. There's an expression that says the fish rots at the head. Ultimately, if your organisational culture is poor and there's poor tone at the top, then chances are that fraud's going to occur within your organisation. So, what are some examples of fraud of how fraud can occur and how fraud can manifest itself across your organisation? Melinda just spoke about quite a number of things that went wrong in both of those grants, and also the V-Line tender. Collusion within the procurement space is one area we can occur. Purchase order splitting really at the local level to try to get under delegations. Your contract variation process potentially can be suspect. I mean, it's not uncommon for tenderers to come in at a fairly low price, and then through the contract variation process, they incrementally increase the amount that they're going to spend. Theft can occur, particularly around the sale or removal of assets. Portable and attractive assets can be potentially vulnerable. Some of you may have been awarded with or provided with a credit card or a fuel card. There is the opportunity for fraud to occur using either of those mechanisms. And some of you may also put in reimbursement claims, etc. That's also the opportunity for fraud to occur at the local level. In terms of employee and contractor screening, one of the things that potentially occur is, everyone will have a resume. Everyone on this call has got a resume, and there's the opportunity within your resume to put in your qualifications and your experience. It's not uncommon for qualifications to be falsified, and for your prior experience to be overstated along with your achievements. In terms of payroll and payables, we've got quite a number of finance staff here today. A lot of the things that you'll see there are things that you probably are familiar with on a day-to-day basis. You'll all be familiar with master file changes and the ability to make those. Segregation of duties or a lack of segregation of duties, the ability potentially to create false vendors and ghost employees is also a way that fraud can manifest itself within your business. In terms of misuse of assets, councils historically, and particularly depots, over the last 20 or 30 years, fraud has been quite systemic in some of those areas, particularly where there's been the purchase and the use of council equipment, and depot staff are using it to run their private businesses on the weekend. Over ordering and using surplus material to do your neighbour's driveway over the weekend or outside work hours has often occurred as well. Information, councils hold a lot of information, whether it's client lists, whether it's payroll information, tax file numbers. So there's enough there to sell to those that are interested. Plus, also you might be aggrieved and you might be on your way out. So your ability to commit fraud might be in terms of corrupting data. The other thing I'd just like to mention in terms of the misuse of vehicles, it's also been an interesting case in local government a while ago, where a company vehicle was also used outside of hours to run an Uber service. So that occurred a little while ago, and I think the only way that was found out was either through fuel records is a way to see that in terms of when they were filling up petrol, once on a Friday after work and once on Monday morning. So there's an element of fraud that can occur there as well. Next, I'm going to hand over to Gabrielle, who's going to touch on some of the red flags and fraud, and is going to introduce a recent global study, and some of the concepts out of that. Over to you, Gabrielle.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and good morning, everyone. One of the key messages that we'd like to portray today is that as finance professionals, you actually are the eyes and the ears of your council, and that you're also in a role of influence, and you can lead a positive culture in the prevention of fraud and corruption. So one of the key things is to just really sort of fine-tune thinking about how fraud can be detected. With internal controls, that is the key way that you can actually detect fraud, or detect that your internal controls are not behaving or not set in the actual way where fraud can be minimalised or detected. So how can this be done? The key sort of terminology that's used around this is fraud red flags. So fraud red flags are actually just warning signs that something isn't as it should be. Now, in picking up a red flag, does it mean that someone is actually committing a fraud? Well, maybe, but also maybe not. But in picking up these red flags, it's also highlighting that the internal controls within your business are not as robust as what they possibly could be to prevent the likelihood of fraud. We've actually put up two sort of categories today, what we've called cultural red flags, and the other side of it is we've called individual behaviour red flags. Some of these are not always apparent, but what we do know, in 85% of cases of fraud, a fraudster has displayed one of these red flags, and in 50% of cases, a fraudster has displayed multiple of red flags. So with the cultural red flag, we've got people that don't provide documentation. So someone's made a purchase card, they've used their purchasing card, and then there's a nondescript purpose. That's an example of a red flag where either if supporting documentation isn't provided or the purpose is nondescript, that as managers and as people in finance, it's really easy to go back to the individual and say, we just need some more information. What that actually does is it actually says that we're looking, we have another set of eyes, and we've got some oversight on these. So partly these things are really not rocket science, they're things that you would actually be doing already within your organisations. But part of the key thing today is just to reflect, are we doing it at the right level, and is enough people doing it? Another example here would be bypassing the procurement process. We see that really particularly with the case studies that Linda's presented, but when we think about local government or even state government or Commonwealth government, the biggest thing that we do is we procure services and we procure goods. So really having confidence that your procurement processes are well designed and that are preventing and are robust enough to either prevent the likelihood of fraud, or people are calling out that things aren't all as they should be, is really a good key area to focus. Another area to really look at, we've got rich data within local government areas, local government organisations. And if we actually look at the gift benefits and hospitality register, it's really interesting. We certainly do it with internal audit. We look at that register and we actually compare it to the time that an organisation is procuring a particular tender. Just little spot checks like that. Again, we would expect it to be clean. If you like, all of us would expect it to be clean. But just doing little spot checks with data that's already available will also give you the confidence that fraud is being minimalised, fraud and corruption is being minimalised. Some of the things on the other side is a key one that we will have all heard about within this group, is when staff don't take holidays. Partly with that, it's often a behaviour of cover-up, and I've certainly, when I've worked in government, seen that when staff didn't take a holiday and someone jumped on and they finally did, we actually uncovered on their computer that they'd been downloading movies and they'd been downloading movies and were running a business of selling movies, and it was a long time ago because we used CDs at the time. So, but again, when they don't take holidays, that is an indicator. I need to preface that COVID-19 and our management of pandemics has meant that our holidays are a bit light at the moment. So a lot of people haven't been taking holidays, but it's certainly a key indicator. What I'd like us to do is moving on is when we actually, and if Andrew, if you could please change us to the next slide. And you have, thank you. Moving on, when I look at the job performance and red flags, what this actual slide is highlighting to us is that when fraud is occurring within an organisation, these are the types of things that culturally is suffering. This data has actually come from the Association of Fraud Examiners, and it's through a recent survey, a global survey, that this has been captured. So what we're typically seeing is that there's poor performance within an organisation, that there's excessive absenteeism, that there's a fear of job loss. A fear of job loss can either be the likelihood for fraud to be increasing, or that people have a fear of reporting, so things aren't reported, excessive tardiness, or people feel that they're denied a raise of promotion. So these are types of performance-y things that occur when symptoms of when fraud is occurring in the organisation. Now, what are some of the ways that we can detect this? And if we just go to the next slide, what we find there at the top, and again, this is through the same global study, we have a term there called tip. That really means a tip-off. So 43% is basically when people internally are saying something doesn't look right here, and they actually report, disclose, and things get investigated. Second on this slide, we can see internal audit can pick up some things, but if we look at it, only 15% of cases can be picked up by internal audit, and 15% of cases can be picked up by management review. So again, it's really important that we have a culture where people are calling out or investigating those red flags, or where people think, oh, I don't think everything looks quite right, and people are actually going and investigating that. I think it's really not surprising that we can see at the very bottom there that 1% is through confession. So obviously, if we're waiting for people to confess that they're being fraudsters within your organisation, I think we'll be waiting some time. What this then leads us to is the next slide, which is looking just to explore a little bit with you more about tipping. So tipping off, how do we tip off? The best way is that when we have what's called a hotline where people can call into. Often hotlines, certainly it's been well used in state government in Victoria for years and years. I have seen evidence of this in local government sector, but this is where we set up a contract with a third party so that somebody feels confident to call that third party. The key probably that I do wish to mention, or a quick sort of thing of caution, if we like, when we set up these lines, we have to make sure that our service level agreements with our third party are also making sure that they encapsulate or don't override our requirements under the Public Disclosure Act, but it is all very doable. So what we see that from these hotlines when we have them is that medium losses were halved. So where we've got, with the hotline, we found that organisations with medium losses, it sort of accounted to 100,000. Again, this is a global study. Without hotlines, it's 198. So it actually was able to minimise half the amount of fraud, these hotlines. So I think that's a pretty impressive stat. The other thing that this is sort of picking up, that we're able to address things more quickly. And also, I think that it's a prevention in of itself, that if these hotlines exist, it's an indication to your organisation that we actually take this seriously, and we have a good culture of reporting. So I think I'll take you to the next slide. Thanks, Andrew. What we're just looking here, and again, it's the same study by a global study, is that what we're looking here is a typical fraudster. And I think to really shortcut this slide, there really is no typical fraudster, and anybody can sort of, I always say no one's born a fraudster, you sort of work your way into it. But what we have got here is characteristics of a fraudster. So firstly, we find that if someone's been within the organisation for a longer period of time, that actually can add to them being a fraudster as a characteristic. Partly that is because they understand the systems, the culture, the behaviour, and they've probably learned where your internal control weaknesses are. The next thing, which for you know, the gender divide, for all of you that sort of are always interested in our gender divide, both males and females can commit fraud. Interesting enough, males, the likelihood is 72% of cases are male and 28% of cases are female. Now, I think what that is, not that it's for me to sort of start putting two data sets together, but basically someone who commits fraud really needs to be in a position to do so. So often we do have more males in decision-making positions in organisations. So I'm just making an assumption that that may be one of the reasons. When we're looking at education, Andrew was just taking us down here to the slide. It's really interesting. Often we can, you know, do a myth busting here, and I think finance people would know this, but basically the typical fraudster will be well educated and well degreed. So the higher educated an individual be, the more likelihood of them falling into the stats of being a fraudster. So it's not always about the cleaner did it. It actually is about people who have educated and have some position of power, knowledge and abilities to do that. With the age, 55 plus, just to go to the bottom right-hand slide of the slide, we've got the older, you know, the older you are, the more likely you are to commit fraud. So again, anybody can commit fraud, but these are some of the characteristics, and these characteristics in the 10 years, 11 years I've been looking at this really haven't changed that much, which I personally find interesting, but they've been quite stable as the characteristics of a fraudster. I'm now going to hand you back over to Andrew, who's just going to take us through some examples of internal controls that we can have within our organisation to ensure that they're robust, which will minimise the likelihood of fraud and corruption. So thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Gabrielle, and just to everyone again, just to echo one of Gabrielle's points that she made as part of her presentation, is that there is no such thing as a typical fraudster. So what can we do as businesses, as in our own individual areas and in our line functions? What can we actually do to try and mitigate the risk of fraud occurring? If we look at it from the concept of employee and contractor screening, it really is around doing thorough reference checking, you know, how to go about verifying qualifications and experience. Now, the New South Wales equivalent of ICAC has got a fairly comprehensive guide in terms of pre-employment screening for public sector employees. So that's quite useful as well. A lot of you in the room today would be responsible for accounts payable and payroll functions. Now, these incidentally aren't every single control and the only controls that need to be implemented and need to be operating effectively, but really just a snapshot of some of the key controls we think are going to be useful. Segregation of duties is one that we like to see. Sometimes, however, that's difficult for some smaller organisations where there just isn't the personnel to be able to do that. There needs to be independence of review and some form of exception reporting. Quite often we'll have the obligation to make changes in master files. But a word of caution in relation to exception reporting. The reports are really only as good as the independence and the thoroughness of the person approving them. So you might have fantastic reports, but if the person's not giving them due attention, then that control is going to fail. And really need to have the opportunity to lock down payment files, particularly when we're talking about accounts payable and payroll, so they don't get manipulated. Over the page in terms of asset management, just to focus on the concept of record keeping versus capitalisation. Your organisation will have a fixed assets policy or the like that will basically say any asset over $3,000 or $5,000 needs to be capitalised on your asset register. But what about everything else? So your organisation would be purchasing things like mobile phones, laptops, printers, tablets, etc. there really needs to be a system for record keeping and monitoring all of those by doing stock takes, assigning all of them an individual asset number. Also in terms of disposals, really around making sure that they're disposed of through an auction house rather than disposed to individual employees. In terms of data and information, we spoke about earlier that councils maintain a lot of information. We really need to make sure that the access people have to databases is only what's required that's commensurate to their role. So for example, directors shouldn't have edit access to payment files or to the banking system, etc. Your IT policies will mandate password complexity. They'll mandate password changes as well. Although in this day and age, multi-factor authentication will also be quite prevalent across your organisations. And to state the obvious, don't share passwords. I think that's something that's really important as well. One of the challenges that organisations have in this space is really trying to find the balance between operational efficiency and also internal controls. You can implement all the controls under the sun to make sure that it's watertight, but ultimately then that's going to restrict you from performing your duties. The flip side is you implement nothing and you make your process all efficient, that then exposes you to the opportunity for fraud to occur. In terms of conflict of interest, we spoke about earlier one of the cases around making sure that they get declared and they actually get captured in a register. A lot of you will be part of tender evaluation panels, and one of the first things presumably you guys would do even before the tender are identified is sign a conflict of interest declaration. Those that are enforcement officer roles, the key control is really around rotation across geographical areas. Gifts, benefits and hospitality is also an area where strong controls need to be in place. You need to have a fairly transparent policy. It needs to be quite clear in terms of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. There's also the opportunity to maybe prohibit, flat out refuse some parts of your business as some offices the ability to accept gifts. Contract managers is probably a key one, particularly when you're dealing with panel contractors as well. Really on your GBH register, you should be capturing not only gifts that are being provided and accepted, but also gifts that are being declined. And that's really important because what you want to see is to monitor to see whether anybody is actually potentially being groomed by a third party or by a supplier as well. In terms of procurement, I mean, if fraud's going to occur, it's going to occur in this space. You really need to have defined policies and procedures, transparent delegations, the declaration of conflict of interest. Quite often we see purchase orders are raised after the fact, and there's also purchase order splitting. Your policies and your system should be set up in a way that they don't occur. Should also have a separate credit card policy as well. So I think in terms of some other controls, checking to see whether your employees are on your vendor master file as well, doing a cross check in that, and also assessing your compliance with the different policy as well by conducting spot checks and also using data analytics. I know a lot of your organisations will have some form of data analytics that get run quarterly to try and pick up any sort of anomalies within your databases. Next, I want to talk about the concept of culture and the impact of fraud. Really, and the main thing I want to focus on is really around the damage to reputation and the hit that it takes to culture. Staff really managers don't know how to manage once it gets to fraud. They think, well, if it's happened here, it's happened to me in this part of the business. How do I know that no one else is committing fraud across our business? So it makes for a really uncomfortable environment. Collaborative approach is really difficult to maintain. Yes, there's going to be some compliance issues and some financial costs as well, but typically they can get mitigated by use of insurance. In terms of organisation and some words to describe organisation, I've got a list of words up there that particularly can be used to describe a culture or an organisation that may facilitate the incidence of fraud, and also on the right-hand side, just some words that potentially can impact or reduce the risk of fraud occurring. And it's really the second part I want to focus about and draw the analogy to the Banking Royal Commission that occurred probably a couple of years ago, where banking is an organisation where you really cannot fail. Quite often they'll try and upsell you, increase your credit card limit, etc. Financial planners try to put you into more riskier investments because it's to sell for them. They have KPIs to meet. If they do not meet their KPIs, they lose their job. It's as simple as that. And what the Commission found was that a lot of the financial planners within those banks were putting vulnerable clients into investments that weren't suited to their risk profile, just to make the sell. So in local government, we feel that we're empowered and we're accountable, and it's okay to fail. So those sorts of words associated with a culture of acceptance, a culture that potentially reduces the risk of fraud as well. What can you do as a business in terms of, what can you do as individuals in terms of some of the dynamics of some of the things that you can do is be a skeptic. Don't believe everything you say. As auditors, we really ask two questions in an internal audit. One is tell me your operating environment, tell me all the things that you do. And the second question is show me, provide me the evidence, give me the level of comfort that what it is that you're telling me you do, you actually do in practice as well. You can ask more questions. Don't accept the story that you're told the first time. Is it real? Is it bona fide? And ultimately do more than necessary, because the behaviour that we tolerate and we don't call out is really the behaviour that we accept. And if everybody accepts these little behaviours that may manifest themselves into fraud, then ultimately a fraud is going to occur within your business. I know that there's some people from Vargo in the room. This is a slide that I've taken from one of the earlier Vargo reports. It really just is designed to highlight some of the areas that a comprehensive fraud control plan should have in place. We spoke earlier around your code of conduct and also your fraud policy. Every business will have one. How do you go about identifying your risks? There's the concept of the risk assessment. Your opportunities to limit fraud is really around your internal control environment and how tight is that. How do you go about raising the awareness across your business? And that's really through sessions like this and other fraud training as well. And there'll also be bodies within your organisation that look at the monitoring of all the controls that you've got in place. So your fraud control plan should really cover off on five key things: how you communicate your intent, how you identify your risks, how you limit your opportunities, how you raise the awareness, and also the monitoring concept as well. And this diagram is really closely aligned to the Australian standard. Your Australian standard will be referenced in your policy, and it goes into a little bit more detail of what a fraud control plan should look like. So what do you do if you suspect fraud? We saw earlier in the poll today that quite a number of you were quite comfortable in understanding or understand the process within your businesses in terms of how to conduct report fraud. Sorry, I nearly said how to commit fraud. That's not the case. So quite simply, don't ignore it. Refer to your organisational policy. It'll be quite prescriptive in terms of the process that needs to occur. All of you will have protected or public interest disclosure officers and coordinators that would be fairly known across your business as well. Quite often the survey said was, in terms of a tip-off, the survey we mentioned earlier was that the fraud gets reported to generally their direct supervisor. But what if it's senior management? What if you suspect that senior management's the one that's committing fraud? Really, there's an opportunity there to talk about people and reporting it outside of the organisation, and that is to either the audit committee chair, to IBAC, to your internal or external auditors, and also the opportunity to report to police. So don't feel that you are limited to reporting fraud or incidents of fraud internally. We spoke earlier about hotlines, so if your organisation does have a hotline, please use that, but there's also some other channels as well. And I think being finance professionals, you guys would know who your audit committee chair is, you guys would know who your internal and external auditors are, so please use them to report frauds as well. We've also got a video that we won't show it now because we're sort of coming to the end of time and would like the opportunity to ask questions, but that really just introduces some of the integrity agencies and their role and who you can actually make a complaint or an allegation to. So it covers off on IBAC, the Inspectorate, and also the Ombudsman as well. Look, that's it from me. Thank you everyone for your participation and your attendance today. I'll hand over to Bradley to see whether there are any questions. I've also got some 3 things that I'd like you guys to consider, but I'll leave with that once we've sort of had the opportunity to go through any questions. Brad, over to you.
Cheers, Andrew, and thank you to you and your team. An interesting world, the space of fraud, and who might be conducting fraud, but I think hopefully that's been really helpful for our members. So I've just whacked in the chat box if anyone does have any particular questions of you and your team. Andrew, maybe one that I had, are you seeing across local government and government sectors, do you think, and probably a hard question to answer, but do you think there's more or less happening, or we're just more aware of fraud and how things are occurring?
Probably all of the above, Brad. I think education programs have increased across the sector. I think organisations are taking it more seriously. Plus, there's also, I mean, we look at all the integrity agencies, and every other month or every other week there seems to be a report coming out from IBAC or from the Inspectorate around fraud occurring. I mean, I'm not speaking out of school here. There's been organisations whereby CEOs have been sacked because they've hired their friends and promoted their friends into senior positions. A lot of instances where credit cards have been abused across organisations as well. So it is prevalent, it is occurring, but hopefully with the work of the integrity agencies and also with the confidence that employees are getting to be able to report an understanding of the process and the protection that's afforded to them, hopefully the instances of fraud are being reduced.
Thank you for that. And we will make the slides available as part of our members update as well. So maybe in light of the time, Andrew, if you want to hit us with our 3 hard-hitting pieces of homework, that'd be much appreciated.
Thanks, Brad. I think 3 things that I encourage you all to do is, one is go to your local policies and your local procedures and really understand what's available, understand the intent, make sure you're aware that they exist, and also familiarise yourself with your public interest disclosures policies, understand who your public disclosure officer is, and also your other associated policies as well, particularly around conflict of interests, gifts, benefits and hospitality, and your procurement one. The second thing I'd like you all to do is really around understanding the fraud risks within your area. So take the opportunity, if you haven't done so already, conduct a fraud risk assessment. Where are the opportunities for fraud to occur? What are some of the controls we have in place that are working well? Plus, more importantly, what else can we do? What else can we do to further mitigate the risk of fraud occurring? If you've already done that, have another look at it and refresh that exercise as well, because I think you'll find it's quite useful, particularly in light of COVID and potentially some of your internal controls may have been affected or potentially even compromised. And thirdly, within your toolbox meetings, I know across the sector and across various businesses, you'll have different meetings where you get together as a team, talk about some of the things that you can do, talk about some of the things that you are doing in relation to mitigating fraud, and really make that culture a little bit more possible, whereby you're encouraging people to speak up and to highlight frauds. Again, I'll just close off by saying that the behaviour that we tolerate as individuals is really the behaviour that we accept. and as individuals, we are the ones that we can drive culture across our business. So take that opportunity to do that as well.
Thank you, Andrew. And I might throw a fourth in that people might consider training like this that we've just been through in this webinar, or something similar for their teams and their leadership. So once again, Andrew, Gabrielle and Linda, thank you very much for coming along this morning, and hopefully it's provided some real insight for our members. Thank you to our 100+ members that jumped on board this morning. So hopefully you can go now and have your morning coffee and digest some of that information, and watch out for the next FinPro webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Bradley. Thanks all.